Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Over the past few months, KRWG News has been covering every angle of the coronavirus pandemic, and there are grave concerns about the short and long-term effects on the economy. New Mexico is being hit especially hard, not only losing jobs and tax proceeds due to unemployment and business closures, but also seeing the state's single biggest source of money evaporate, oil and gas revenues. With me to discuss it all is KRWG.org columnist and a professor at New Mexico State University, Dr. Chris Erickson. He's also the Carruthers Chair for Economic Development and the head of the department there at New Mexico State University. Chris, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I wish the circumstances were more pleasant, but I'm always happy to be on KRWG.
Well, we are happy to have you, and as I mentioned, you write a column frequently for KRWG.org, which is also published in the Las Cruces Bulletin. And your most recent column that we published noted that forecasting is really difficult in this economic collapse because it's so unprecedented in many ways.
That's right. We really have no historical analog to what we're facing right now. Of course, sometimes we will point back to the 1918 pandemic, flu pandemic, which in some ways was more severe than the current pandemic. But the economy over 100 years ago is just not comparable to the economy today. Other analogies that people often point to is the Great Depression, but the Great Depression was a much slower process than what we're going through now. Maybe ultimately in its total magnitude, it was about the same level or even a little bit greater level. But in terms of the speed and the onslaught, it's not comparable. There really is no historical comparison. And when you're trying to make forecasts without a historical comparison, it's very difficult.
Yeah, it really is something to see the effects that are already happening, the businesses that are closing. And we should mention that this program is being taped at the end of May, so there may be additional developments that occur by the time it airs. However, one thing we can talk about is that thus far, the biggest effort by the federal government has been the so-called CARES Act, a huge federal stimulus program. It's also getting a lot of criticism. What do you make of this program?
Well, the CARES Act is an important piece of legislation that goes a long ways towards resolving our problems we're facing in our economy, but doesn't perhaps go far enough. And then also you can criticize the way it was structured. So right now, the way the CARES Act is working, of course, it's increasing unemployment benefits. And some people criticize those for being too generous. Then also it is, and I think an important aspect of it is how it's dealing with small businesses. And the way the CARES Act is working with small businesses is it's making loans to those small businesses through the SBA. Now, the SBA loans in turn are administered by private banks. And that's really unique in the world for doing that. In Europe and other countries in the world, the way that these same kinds of funds are being allocated to small businesses. And of course, some of the businesses aren't that small. Some of the businesses that got CARE Act funds were fairly large. But the way this has been allocated to small businesses has been these loans, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty as to how to qualify for the loans. If you use the loan correctly, then the result is the loan is converted to a grant. but what exactly are the rules by which you had to comply in order to get that conversion to a grant? Answer, nobody knows because the rules haven't been written yet, or if they have been written, they've been revised several times, and there's a great deal of uncertainty there. I have one acquaintance who is a Amazon entrepreneur, and he's has a relatively small loan of about 35,000, and he's trying to be as careful as he can to make sure that that converts to a grant at the end of the day by maintaining his employment. It also can be used for rent. It can be used for interest payments. But exactly what counts as rent, what counts as interest payment, who are the employees that had to be covered, it's very uncertain. I have another grant which I'm actually more involved in, which is for a nonprofit, something called the Western Social Sciences Association, which I'm a member of the board of directors. And we've gotten a grant there. It's a small grant, but it's being used to support the staff. And again, if that's not converted into a loan, because this is a very small, the budget of that organization is very small, and $9,000, which is the amount of the loan that's been taken out, it'd be very hard for that organization to repay if that's not converted to a grant. And so we're both in that nonprofit business and also my friend's for-profit business. It's a struggle. Other nations in Europe, for example, are not using loans and administered by banks, but in fact, instead are using just straightforward government grants. You submit your taxes. If you have certain expenses on there, mainly salaries, then you get 100% credit, and the government refunds it to you in the form of basically a tax refund. That seems more straightforward. It's easier to understand. What counts as an expense on a tax return is well understood, whereas these SBA loans are more difficult. That said, man, it's so much better than nothing.
Yeah.
It is so much better than nothing.
So, you've detailed some of the confusion on the business side. I want to touch on the unemployment side as well. One aspect of the CARES program, as you referenced, is an extra $600 per week or $2,400 a month for people who are unemployed. Some have argued that this was really a bad policy because people are often making more money on jobless benefits that are scheduled to end at the end of July, I believe it is. A University of Chicago study found that 7 in 10 unemployed workers who collect unemployment get benefits that exceed what they earned at work. And critics say, as you would imagine, this makes it hard to get folks back into the labor force when they're making more money sitting home. Who could blame them?
Absolutely. I'm not sure it's the sitting at home part. It's that they want to feed their family. And how can you justify going to work at a lower salary when your goal is to feed your family? It's not a matter of laziness. It's a matter of concern for your family and to have the resources that give your family a good life. And there may be some people who literally sitting there going, well, I don't want to work. Even at lower unemployment benefits, it would be hard to get them to go to work. But I think that's an exception, not the rule. Having said that, it doesn't make sense economically to give perverse incentives in the form of workforce participation to people who by giving them too high unemployment benefits.
Yeah, I mean, and the other issue, of course, Chris, is the money is not unlimited in terms of being able to help people. And we have already seen, that there are going to be some people who are going to be unemployed for a long time. And this is very clear. We've had permanent restaurant closures, restaurants that have said, we're not going to open back up again. And so critics say that instead of giving people an extra $600 a week for unemployment, that what should have been done is that money should have been saved to help the long-term unemployed get, regular unemployment benefits for a longer period if they're unable to get a job.
Yeah, well, of course, one of the issues that comes up and has gotten some traction recently is the idea of guaranteed income. And the way that would work is you just simply would say every American, you get this amount of money each month or each year, depending how you set up, different ways set up, and you eliminate unemployment insurance because you say, well, if you become unemployed, you have your guaranteed income. You eliminate welfare, you eliminate TANF, you eliminate food stamps. And go to this guaranteed income. And there's a lot of advantages to that in terms of economics. It's a program supported by socialists. It's a program supported by libertarians. It's not a program associated by mainstream promoted by mainstream Democrats and Republicans, but it is a program that I think is getting a lot more play. And the advantage of that, of course, is that you don't have to worry about do we increase unemployment insurance and how much do we increase unemployment benefits by during a downturn. We just have this backstop always in place.
Without something like that, though, Chris, don't you think that there is going to be a need for additional federal assistance that helps the states to help the long-term unemployed, assuming that this is a big problem? It sure looks like it's going to be.
It is going to be a big problem, but I'm not sure that so one of the things, of course, right now the federal deficit is scheduled to be projected to be $3.7 billion this fiscal year. That ends in October.
Right? $1 trillion, right?
Trillion, yes, that's right. Trillion, yes, T. If I said B, I'm sorry. It's just a force of habit.
Yeah.
But it's $3.7 trillion for this fiscal year and over $2 trillion for the next fiscal year. And people are concerned about that. But I would argue that kind of deficit is a secondary issue. It's not a zero issue. You need to keep in the back of your mind. But the fact is that we have a lot of capacity for running deficits in this country. With the current deficit, it's expected that we'll go to about 101% of GDP for our debt. Next year will be 108. Japan is at about 250% of its debt to GDP. Other countries in the world exceed 100% pretty routinely. And while I do agree we probably spent too much in the short run on unemployment, we gave perverse incentives to some people not to work, which is an error. I'm not sure that means we can't provide long-term benefits also for those who need it.
All right, well, we'll have to see what happens in terms of any additional federal assistance. Another area, as I know you're well aware of, where folks say federal assistance is needed, is the public sector. State and local budgets decimated due to this economic collapse, a reduction in tax revenue. Give us a picture of this nationally and here in New Mexico.
Well, as I mentioned, the deficit is very high nationally. It is. I don't think it's an issue. We have a lot of room as a country to expand. As you know, most listeners are aware, the federal government's different from a household in that households can't print money, but the federal government can. And the federal government literally can write a check with no money in the bank, and when it's presented to the Federal Reserve will cover it. And that's different from what happens for a private individual. So I'm not so concerned at the national level about the issue, although it's very large deficits, and it's not a zero concern, but it's a low concern.
So it sounds like you're thinking that the federal government should provide assistance to the public sector, to local government, state government.
I do think that. And the public sector, particularly in New Mexico, we've got a lot of problems. We have a deficit right now that's 1.7, that's been estimated to be 1.7 billion to 2.4 billion on a $7.5 billion budget. That is massive. It's going to require cuts. There's concern in MSU that may require layoffs. Now, that those layoffs, the central administration is not predicting layoffs, but they're also not ruling them out. I will tell you right now that the number one issue for recovery in Las Cruces is getting NMSU up and running again after the COVID ends. Bringing students back to campus is the number one issue for Las Cruces. That's going to require funding from the state, and the state doesn't have the money to do it. There is a real need for government, for federal government aid to the states. I agree with you 100%. I agree with that 100%.
So another issue for New Mexico, of course, is that along with all of the other reductions, we have this massive price decline for oil and gas. How bad is this picture?
Well, it's terrible. The state budget, one of the reasons for the shortfall of the state government, the big reason, of course, is the decline in gross receipts taxes. People stopped spending during the crisis, during the COVID pandemic. But another big reason for the decline in the state budget is that the Permian Basin, where we produce oil and gas revenues for the state, has seen a dramatic drop in price. People watching this will probably remember that the price of oil hit an all-time low. This is an intraday low, not a closing low, but a low of $42, minus $42 a barrel. It's minus $42 a barrel. And there were a number of technical reasons why that happened, and it's quickly corrected. Just before airtime, I looked up, and the price of oil currently in West Texas is $32 a barrel. But even at that level, the amount of exploration, the amount of oil production is going to decline. Is going to decline rapidly in New Mexico, and that's going to have a huge impact on state revenues. One more thing that I'll mention before I leave this topic is that we're now using we now rely much more on fracking than we used to. And fracking produces a much more oil per oil well, but it also declines much more rapidly once you get past that initial first year or year and a half of production. And that means that if we stop drilling for oil, in the past we've seen relatively slow declines. We stop drilling for oil, which we essentially have in the Permian, we're going to see a very rapid decline in production. That means a rapid decline in tax revenues and royalty revenues for the state.
Okay, and we should remind folks that the oil price you mentioned is at the end of May, $32 a barrel. Yep. That's been up and down. Another thing I want to ask you about, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, as you know, has talked about the possibility of eventually tapping a larger percentage of revenue from the permanent fund. This would require voter approval to do this. What are your thoughts on this?
I 100% support that. The permanent fund is there to help people. It's supposed to be there as a kind of an emergency reserve. Well, if this isn't an emergency, what is? People are concerned about cutting into the principal as opposed to the revenue. Of course, the permanent fund is providing revenue for education and other programs for many years, primarily education. But now we have a real need to take steps to keep the economy going, to keep to keep us on track. And if we could get to use the permanent fund, and for example, to cut taxes as a stimulus for the economy, maintain our spending at the state and local level, yet cut taxes for the private sector to help with the recovery. That would be something that would pay dividends into the future.
And Chris, I think a lot of people hearing you say this, some of them may be surprised knowing that you usually are fairly conservative, but then other folks would say they understand this because this truly is an emergency. I mean, not only unprecedented nationally, but the effect on New Mexico much worse than many other states, because besides oil and gas being decimated, our other huge business in this state is tourism and hospitality, two of the hardest hit industries. We don't have a lot of manufacturers. You know, a lot of our business is restaurants, hospitality, hotels, and this is a decimated industry.
Yep.
What are you thinking about this?
Well, hospitality and leisure is down 44% in employment. What is? How can you even think about that? It is an industry that is just shut down, and it is very difficult to know how they're going to recover in any meaningful way in the near future. I'm going to tell you a quick story, and I'm sure other people have similar stories. We were thinking, I just had a new granddaughter born. It's my first granddaughter. I'd love to go see that grandchild. We
Congratulations.
Thank you. We planned and we decided to go, and we just decided now today that we're not going to go in the short run. At least we're going to wait till
Yeah.
July.
Oh,
And
I'm in the same boat. I totally understand that. We've had several trips canceled due to the pandemic, and I was
Yep.
talking with my wife about this, and we're not sure even if we're going to do the cross-country road trip because we need to make sure that things are safe enough even to expose ourselves and have others exposed to us.
Exactly, and that is actually the thing that made me change my mind. We were going to drive, so we avoided air travel and all that, and we were going to do it in one day, and so we were going to stay in hotels. But the problem is, I looked at NMSU's guidelines, which say if you go out of state, you need to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And I thought to myself, well, is that realistic? And I did a little bit of research, and yes, even if you're taking due diligence, due precautions, you need to really think twice before you travel.
I hadn't even
And
thought about that. So really, you bring up a great point that if folks follow the rules, makes maybe a trip even impractical. If they take 2 weeks off, actually it becomes taking 4 weeks off because they have to quarantine when they come back.
exactly. And of course, we can do a lot of our stuff over the internet as we're doing now, but you're not supposed to go to the grocery store. You're not
That's
supposed to
right.
go to
That's right.
etc.
So
And I just said it's not feasible to do. And this is going to be in place for a long time.
yeah.
This is not, these travel restrictions are going to be here. And then even then, people are going to be very concerned about traveling.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And some have argued, Chris, we're quickly running out of time, so I want to get to this, that the pandemic has really highlighted one of the longest discussions in New Mexico politics. You're probably sick of this discussion because you've been talking about it for decades. Just you and I have been talking about it for 12 years, if you can
Yes.
believe that. The need to diversify our economy in New Mexico. This year, legislators again failed to pass the legalization of recreational marijuana. What are your thoughts on this for the next session?
Well, of course, I'm a big proponent, being a kind of a libertarian type. I'm a big proponent of legalizing drugs, and I have been my whole life, even though I myself don't take them and don't have a desire to take them. I still think they should be legalized. But that said, while I don't think that legalizing marijuana will lead to significant diversification of the economy, it would lead to a small diversification. And generally, it's very difficult for economies to diversify because, for example, our oil and gas industry here, our oil and gas industry is here because we have oil and gas and other places don't have it. And that gives us this natural advantage in oil and gas production. And the question is, can we figure out some way to increase diversification? That's one of the reasons why I was talking about the permanent fund, that if you were to tap the permanent fund and use that tap again, as I mentioned, you use it for a number of things, but one idea that I think has a lot of merit is cutting taxes to make New Mexico a more attractive place for businesses to locate. And it would help with diversification. I don't think it's a magic bullet for diversification, but it would be a help with diversification.
In addition to recreational marijuana, and of course we always talk about renewable energy because we have a lot of sun and a lot of wind, are there other specific areas where you think the legislature should really target action next session? Because this is, again, it's an emergency.
Yeah, so if I were doing this, I would follow the strategy. And then, of course, when you're talking about diversification, economic development, you're always talking about a long-term strategy. Development and diversification and structural change in the economy occurs over decades, not years. And I would follow a strategy that was adopted in North Carolina very successfully, other states very successfully, and that is to first of all to focus on K-12 education, make sure we have a strong pipeline there of trained and qualified workers, but then also higher education. And what I would do there is I would find three or four, and I'd say three or four because you don't know if you're going to be right or wrong, but three or four cutting edge industries that we anticipate will be important 10 years from now. And I would invest in attracting very high quality scientists in that area to our universities by creating areas of excellence, centers of excellence. And then I would also, and this is key, I would invest in attracting very high quality graduate students to come work with those scientists, because the graduate students who go out and start the businesses and the industries and do the creative stuff. Certainly the professors who might be involved in it to some extent, but it's graduate students who are going to be the ones who are going to be the innovators and the ones who are the leaders 10 years from now. And that's what I would do. The problem is the return on that next year will be zero. It's an investment. And the return on that over the next 4 years, assuming the governor is reelected, will be very low. And it's very hard for politicians to say, let's make an investment that has a payoff 10 years from now after they've been out of office for 6 years. I don't have much hope for this, but that's the kind of program you have to adopt if you really want to address the diversification of the state.
All right, well, Chris, we'll have you back on in a few months to get an update on how things are going, your assessment of what the additional actions have been taken by the feds and the states and possibly local government too. We thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. I always appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Later,
that is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.